While we have a main attachment stance in life, we can get triggered into other states by things happening in our relationship. So I think about a couple I knew where both of them were definitely avoidant, and they just sort of lived this kind of parallel life thing, but it was working for them until one of them got anxious because they felt threatened by something that was happening in their partner's life. And then they looked very anxious. The other partner got more avoidant. And it wasn't until they both did some therapy that they started to both shift. And at one point, the avoidant partner said to his wife something like, you're 99% of what I want in a partner. And she was like, I didn't even think you liked me anymore at all. And as they both shifted, I would say they have a much more secure relationship now. So that's part of why it's worth figuring these things out, because we have a certain attachment style that we developed, which was an adaptation that made sense to whatever the social environment we were born into, which we didn't choose, was, and that we carry it out in the world, but it doesn't work so well with our adult relationships. It tends to drive people we really want in our life away. And, if we can start to identify it, we can also start to shift it.
Welcome to Therapist Uncensored. Building on decades of professional experience, this podcast tackles neurobiology, modern attachment, and more in an honest way that's helpful in healing humans. Your session begins now with Dr. Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott.
Hey, everybody. For those of you that want to learn the real science of attachment, not the, TikTok therapy, one question, and your attachment style, but what the science really says and how to apply it in real life, then you are in the right place. And there are several new opportunities coming up. The first is Ann and I are going to be doing a free webinar with Psych Alive on March 12th from noon to 1:30 Central. It is free entirely. You can purchase CEs if you would like, but the webinar itself is free. And we're going to really go into the myths that are out there and focus on the science itself and how to apply it, like I said, in real life. There's also some opportunities that we are making available for you to be able to learn in small groups. And that is either through the book, Secure Relating, Holding Your Own in an Insecure World, or the course, Beyond Attachment Styles. Professionally led small groups, you can go through the material together and really get your hands in how to use it and apply it. If you're interested in that, go to info@therapistuncensored.com to sign up. And for the webinar, go to psychalive, PSYCH, alive.org. And you can find the webinar there, as well as a lot of other tools for therapists and the public. Our guest today is Lisa Firestone. She is a psychologist that has worked for a very long time with all of the attachment researchers, including specifically Dr. Dan Siegel. She also is one of the founders of Psych Alive, and that is a platform that has been going for 3 decades now. And it is chock full of resources for the public and for therapists, and we really want to encourage you to visit it. In today's episode, we are going to get into some of her research on suicidality, specifically for therapists and families that have lost someone to suicide. And then we're also going to just do the real deep dive into the real science and how to apply it to real life. This is somebody who is an expert at this, and it was a lovely conversation, and I know that you will enjoy it. So let's welcome Dr. Lisa Firestone. I'm sitting today with our guest, Lisa Firestone. Can you launch us by just telling us a little about yourself?
Sure. I'm a clinical psychologist, have been for quite a while here in Santa Barbara, California. And I do clinical practice. I see a lot of couples and people, and been interested in this work for a long time. My dad was a psychologist. It's an intergenerational condition in our family. I now ran an office for my son, who's a clinical psychologist. I've always been interested in relationships. I've been in a long-term marriage for a very, very long time with somebody I've known since we were 7. So we've got really a lot of history, but know each other really well. And I do think that understanding yourself and knowing your own attachment issues and your own tendencies when things get stressful in a relationship is just really important. And that's part of why I value it so much.
You are so kind about that. It is so nice to kind of hear about it now that it's out and all of that's over. It really is so gratifying to hear that, anybody's read it even, or certainly that it made an impact. So it's wonderful.
It did. I not only read it, I made my husband read it too. And I recommend it to all my friends because I feel like it's so helpful to understand your part. It's so easy to see what your partner is doing wrong, but it's much harder to look at
And the
yourself.
problem with that is what? Yeah.
That's what everybody else. Yeah.
Exactly. I can relate. And I can also know the value of shifting that paradigm, which is part of why today what we'll be talking about is how, as a just person out in the world, to really use this science and apply it into your real lives. But before then, I wanted to mention, you've been doing mental health work for a very long time, and with the Glendon Association and with Psych Alive, kind of continuing your father's, who's well known and well respected legacy. Did you want to say anything about either of those organizations?
Sure. Psych Alive was our attempt, or my stepmother's actually attempt, Lisa Firestone, to translate my father's work for the general public, to make it really accessible to people. So on that website, we have all kinds of blogs and we do webinars like we're going to do with you coming up. We're excited about on subjects that we think are important for people. The idea of Psych Alive was being alive to yourself, alive to your relationships, alive to your children, to really be fully yourself. And how do you do that? And we have lots of continuing education webinars on there, but we also have ones that are just available for the general public, and people use them just because they're interested in their own development. We also have some e-courses on there that we've developed with different people, walking people through the steps of different things. I did one with Dan Siegel on attachment, but there's ones on all different subjects. So the idea is just to make really good psychological information available to people, because people go so much more to the internet for things now than even sometimes, going to therapy. So want to make those available. And we've really merged the Glendon website into Psych Alive at this point. That was our website originally more for the professional audiences, but they're now all one.
One of the things that you're known for, I believe, is continuing his work on violence and suicidality. And I guess if people are interested in that they could find information there at Psych Alive about some of that research. Is that right?
Yes, they can. They can find information about the research. They can look at the trainings that we provide. But also, we have some webinars on those subjects with different professionals in suicide prevention world that I think are really important, because the standard of care has just changed so much with suicide. We didn't used to know much about what worked and what didn't. We now have a huge body of research, a lot funded by our military, who had a big problem with suicide, but we have much more knowledge than we did. And so we make that accessible. But we also do for the general public, like, how do you do a safety plan with a friend who you're worried about? How do you identify suicide risk in somebody you care about? So we have all of those things up there as well. We have links to the scales we developed in our research, looking at how negative thoughts towards yourself or about other people can drive either outward directed violence or inward directed violence. And for some people, it is really a flip of a coin which way it'll go when they're stressed enough. They will do things to regulate themselves by either lashing out or hurting themselves. And both are just strategies for trying to regulate, but they're not healthy strategies, obviously, either of them.
Well, since we brought it up, in case we've piqued anyone's interest, is there kind of one or two, you must know this about suicide, since we have an expert that you would want to share?
Yeah, I think, the idea of safety planning or crisis response planning, people call it different things, is that, helping the person manage their own crises, that when somebody's suicidal, they're probably going to have a crisis again. And I think it's a helpful idea, even if where they go is not suicide, they just get into really a bad place. When you're in crisis, how do you recognize you're getting there? What are the things you can do yourself to help make yourself feel better that have worked for you in the past? So it's personalized strategies not general. And then who are the people you can call that just distract you and, put you in a lighter mood? Or is there anybody in your actual social circle that you could just talk to who would help you with this? And then who are the professionals you can call, and what's the hotline number and all those sorts of things, the outside resources. But what can you do to help manage it? And how can you make your home safe is the last one. So let's get anything out of the house that could be immediately hurtful to you, if you're in that kind of state. And the idea there is that whenever you put time between a person and their plan to hurt themselves, you do a lot to save a life, because people are only in that state for a certain amount of time. It's time limited. And if you can get them through that time, so a really dramatic example is a woman who was going to drive up to our local bridge and take her life. This was before we put up barriers. We have barriers up now, but it took 10 years to get done. But she was going to pull out of her driveway, and this older man who walks his dog in her neighborhood stopped behind her car with his dog and engaged her in conversation for 20 minutes. He had never really talked to her before. She has no idea why he did this. But by the time he walked away, she turned off her car and went back inside. She was no longer in that state. So just putting a pause button on it, what you don't want to have is easily accessible ways to hurt yourself when you are in a fragile state, whatever that might be. I think those are one thing that we do need to know, is that safety plan, and we now know it works, that it really helps people, even if they write it down and they never look at it again or pull it out. It helps save lives.
That there's something about engaging in that process.
Yeah, it's just really important. And the person's supposed to write it themselves. If you write things down, you remember them more. You can take a picture of it and put it in your phone. And there are online versions of it, but it's better to write it down.
Well, even just writing it down already is going to activate different neural networks where you're observing something, your time comes back in, because this is a future thing, which, and a lot of times when we're super activated, it's everything is right now.
Everything is right now.
And it feels like it will always be that way.
Right. And, thinking about things that helped you in the past, there probably were some things when you were upset. And you're not thinking like that there's other alternatives to help regulate yourself that are not nearly as self-destructive. That's one thing I think is really helpful. And we also know there's some therapies out there that actually work now, and we didn't know that before. And in general, what some of the research is showing is that therapy period is helpful, even treatment as usual, if you will, which is what we always in randomized clinical trials compare things to often. I just actually recently was at a conference that the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention co-hosts with the Suicide Research Consortium, and they were talking about a study where they compared one kind of therapy, CAMS, which was developed by my friend and colleague David Jobs, and dialectic behavioral therapy, which was one of the first therapies that we saw had an impact on people who were suicidal, and treatment as usual. And this was with very suicidal college students who often had made one or two attempts already. And they all got better, and nobody died. And if one therapy wasn't working, they shifted to one of the other ones of the three-pronged approach they were taking. It was really interesting. And the collaborative assessment and management of suicide, or CAMS, really did come out as being particularly helpful after treatment as usual. Like, build a relationship first, then do this very suicide-specific therapy. Anyhow, we know a lot of things for all different groups.
That's great. That is really great. And, so many times therapists will jump into their thinking of their supervisors of like, and it can become kind of rote, like, oh, I need a plan, and now the client sometimes ends up taking care of you. I'm thinking longer term therapy of like, don't worry, I'm not going to do it, or I know I have to tell you that I'm not going to act until so it becomes something not as intended or something. And then the other thought that makes, when I think about complications or making it realistic to how it is in the world, you know what I mean, for the average person, there's also this idea of, I have an impulse to cut myself, which is different than being suicidal, or even I want this to all end. And is that the same thing as suicidality? And then last just layer of thought is the idea of, is there such a thing as chronic suicidality, or is that something else? So I don't know if any of those things gives you a thought to respond to, but
Yeah, the thing about cutting is a self-regulation strategy, right? Not our favorite one. And often therapists just want to get you to stop. And what I would say to therapists is don't just get people to stop, because if it's working for them, it's working for them. Teach them other skills first. Then we can talk about stopping the cutting or whatever self-destructive coping strategy they're using. But you don't want to just rip it away, because then you're saying, oh, have no coping strategies. And that's, I think, a really bad idea. And one of the things we've learned from the research is that of the things that work, here's the things they have in common. One thing is they all teach skills for both regulating emotion in healthy ways and tolerating emotion. And those, I would say, are the two characteristics that suicidal people have in common. They're a diverse group, but they have trouble regulating emotion and trouble tolerating it, just sitting with it. If you're just passively wishing everything was over, that's one thing, but that's different than taking actions. And when does it get into taking actions? And the problem is when people do take actions, they get easier and easier to take. So that's one thing I think we need to pay attention to. If there's even been a very, what they call low lethality suicide attempt, something that wasn't really going to end their life, that doesn't mean that that paves the way for much more lethal attempts. So I think we have to be careful not to classify those as, oh, they're just trying to manipulate or they weren't serious, which is something that I see therapists do over and over again. But I do think cutting or self-harm is a different category of behavior, and that we shouldn't assume it's always going to lead to the other, and that we should, again, replace it with healthy coping skills. But if we want to do good suicide treatment, we need to teach skills. We need to get the person's own ideas about their suicidality. They need to be person-centered kind of approaches, where we see them as the expert, not us. Instead of, going down our list of checks of symptoms or whatever, or reaching out to our supervisor who was probably trained 20 or 30 years ago and doesn't know anything about what's really going on and what we know about what works for suicide.
Well, it's activating for therapists because we suddenly there's not under my watch, besides the care and all of the other things, there's also this feeling of threat that can happen about, like, do I need to tell do I need to move into action now? Do I need to inform someone? Is there, what, like it just brings to mind a whole different set of things that can take us out of the room.
Yes, because it stirs up so much anxiety in us. And I think it's part of what interferes with our clinical judgment around it. But I think if we can just really try to meet the person where they are, understand what it means to them, understand how they got there. There's a Swiss psychiatrist who came up with this method where the first thing you do is you do an interview where you ask them, basically, how did it come to you being suicidal? And then you sit back and you listen. And you just ask clarifying questions if you need to, but you just let them really tell the story. And that's really helpful to people for themselves to understand it, but also for you to really understand how it goes for them and where it started from. So, yeah, and then it's important to do caring follow-up with people. Caring contacts, that's the first thing we knew worked, was a postcard study, sending a postcard once a month to people who've dropped out of therapy but who were suicidal. I'm still here, hope things are going well, if you need anything. Very low-cost intervention, low effort, but saves lives for treatment-resistant folks who don't want to come to therapy. So caring contacts, follow-up, suicide-specific. Let's focus on getting suicide in the rearview mirror. Then we can work on other things that are going on in your life. But if we don't get that in the rearview mirror, you're not alive for those other things. So then we can work with people on how to create a life worth living. What would make their life worth living? What would make them want to stick around? And we can work on increasing their, quotes, hooks into life. Good relationships are definitely one of those things.
Wait, I'm sorry. What did you say? Coats, hooks, and
I
delights?
said good relationships are definitely one of those things that are like a hook into life,
Oh, a hook into life. That's what it was. Okay.
Yeah, more hooks,
Yes. Yeah, we need to be belayed in for sure. It's a rough world. That's nice. Well, thank you for sharing some of those highlights and tips. Yeah. And there's much more resource at Psych Alive. to find out more about this, if this has piqued your interest for you as a listener, if struggling with this, or if you're a clinician that works in this area. It is hard out there. It is hard. And there's not enough resources and not enough support, no matter where you are. So it's a good to touch on this for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And as a clinician, you may think that you're not treating that population, but I think about one of my early, when I was doing an internship, I had a couple that came to me with typical couples issues. It didn't seem like I was going to be dealing with suicide at all. Then the husband's brother died very suddenly at a young age, made him very aware of his own mortality. He felt responsible for his brother's wife and kids financially. And then he lost his job. And when he was scattering his brother's ashes, he wanted to, jump after them out of the plane. It was pretty scary. So I didn't think that's what I was going to be dealing with. But sometimes, even when you don't think that's what you're going to be dealing with, it's what you're dealing with.
And have you had a client commit suicide in your practice?
I have not while they were in ongoing treatment with me. I did have somebody that years later I found out, only because her sister came back and wanted to talk it through a bit. That's how it came that I knew about it. But it is really a traumatic loss for people. And, the statistics are 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 therapists have had this kind of loss. Or if you're doing a lot of clinical work, you're very likely to have this kind of loss.
Yeah, and it's definitely one of those things that you don't meet somebody at a conference and introduce yourself in this. It's not something that you put forward. And what about for therapists that have gone through this? Any thoughts or words of wisdom?
Yeah, there are online support groups where you meet with other therapists. Just like for family members, it's really important to go to a suicide survivor support group. It's really important for therapists to do that, maybe with other therapists, where you can talk openly about this and recognize that you're not the only one. And you need to be able to talk about your feelings. Because just like families want to blame therapists, therapists want to blame families too, or somebody, because suicide loss is just hard. Because, if somebody killed somebody you care about, you'd be certainly upset with that person. But when the victim and the perpetrator are the same person as they are in suicide, it's a little confusing. And there's a tendency to want to blame somebody else, and it's just really important to work through our own feelings about it and to make sense of it for ourselves. And just to know that, psychiatrists lose even more patients to suicide, and it's not because they do a worse job. It's because they see more severely disturbed clients. And, there just is a fairly high correlation between mental health disorders and suicide. Not complete, by the way, but it is a higher risk.
Hey, you guys, while we know relationships are wonderful, they are also really hard. Many of us believe that they shouldn't be, that if we have good connection and good communication, things will just go smoothly. But it's really that belief that can make us feel stubborn and even more hopeless. So relationships take work. It does for Sue and I. We can make it look easy. It's not. And one of the ways is because many of us, we differ. We differ in what activates us, what makes us feel threat, the expectation, and it's these differences that are held in our body, not our thoughts. And they influence how we talk, how we love, how we fight. So holding that belief, if he or she or they could just understand me, if they love me, they do something different, is not really true. And we're talking about relationships with your partner, your teenager, your mother-in-law. So Sue and I have created an online course that can help you understand yourself and those you love in a different way. This is not just for therapists, it's for everyone. Although the good news is if you're a therapist, you can get CEs along the way, and all of you can use the visuals and the worksheets individually, or you can even use them in your own private practice. So while the course is based on our book, Secure Relating, Holding Your Own in an Insecure World, it is definitely not a replication of the book. We talk directly to you. You learn how to understand more deeply your attachment, those you love, the neuroscience behind it, and how to build secure types of connections right now in your everyday relationships. Rather than changing one another, y'all can shift together in very important ways. It's very powerful. We're getting great reviews. Check it out. It's at therapistuncensored.com/BAS. Therapistuncensored.com/BAS. The BAS stands for Beyond Attachment Styles, the Science of Growing Secure Adult Relationships. And by the way, the cost of the course is about the amount of one individual therapy session, and yet you get hours and hours and hours of what we think is extremely valuable information. So check it out.
Shall we shift into a more sunny,
Let's do that. That would be wonderful.
So we had promised to help people be able to use the research on attachment in identifying their own patterns and potentially, their partners or their close people. So why can't I just say, with this 6-step questionnaire, which you can get online. You can get online. I think there's one website that it's like one question will tell you. So what's the problem with that approach?
Yeah, I don't think it gets at the intricacies of attachment. And I also think that we're just really bad judges of our own attachment. So especially one thing I've noticed is that people who have an avoidant attachment
Or secure.
Yes. Or
They identify as secure.
They identify as secure, and because they feel like their strategy of shutting down makes sense. They don't look emotional. They don't look out of control. Their partner does when they shut down, because that tends to send their partner, into dysregulation. Also, you can think you're avoidant, or you can think you're anxious when you're avoidant, because if you have any want or need for your partner, it feels like so much want or need, because that's such an uncomfortable feeling for you as an avoidant person that you feel like you're very anxious, even though your main strategy may not be that, and your main attachment might not be that. So that's another way that I think avoidant people get confused about their attachment is, oh, but I act so desperate because I said I want something from you. That's way too much to be asked. That's the other side of it. Also, while we have a main attachment stance in life, we can get triggered into other states by things happening in our relationship. So I think about a couple I knew where both of them were definitely avoidant, and they just sort of lived this kind of parallel life thing, but it was working for them until one of them got anxious because they felt threatened by something that was happening in their partner's life. And then they looked very anxious. The other partner got more avoidant. And it wasn't until they both did some therapy that they started to both shift. And at one point, the avoidant partner said to his wife something like, you're 99% of what I want in a partner. And she was like, I didn't even think you liked me anymore at all. And as they both shifted, I would say they have a much more secure relationship now. So that's part of why it's worth figuring these things out, because we have a certain attachment style that we developed, which was an adaptation that made sense to whatever the social environment we were born into, which we didn't choose, was, and that we carry it out in the world, but it doesn't work so well with our adult relationships. It tends to drive people we really want in our life away. And, if we can start to identify it, we can also start to shift it. And so that's why I think it's really important. If I didn't think it was changeable or, something you could do something about, it'd be one thing. But I think it is something where we can make those shifts. And it might be a lot of work for some people. I'm not trying to say we can turn off a switch, but we can start to recognize it.
Some of the problem with those little questionnaires and, the oversimplicity is that the particularly infant attachment and developmental attachment, we're talking about unconscious processes. So even therapists, for example, cannot be that great, not that accurate, because it's unconscious and we look pretty good. And, when we're in a certain role, the whole idea of actually being assessed is that it gets at something underneath your conscious thoughts. It gets at some of your early limbic learning. And again, when we feel safe, we all look pretty secure and we all function pretty securely, which is part of why, in the book that we talk about, rather than like avoidant people or whatever we say, that we all have all the strategies, but that we might lean in a particular direction. So those that lean blue and those that lean red, blue meaning kind of more of the zipped up, and red meaning the little bit more anxious. So another thing I've noticed is like if you do tend to be a little bit more grounded in your secure implicit patterns, where that you assume. One of the things I love about it is like there's an assumption that you're worthy, and there's an assumption that people are going to be there. I remember like finding this out. It's like, really, people actually have that. My oldest son was getting ready to launch, and I was being kind of like, but wait, we have to. And he's like, Mom, I'm not going away. You're going to have me for the rest of your life. We're not ending. I'm like, oh my God, you're more secure than I am. So that it changes, and that secure folks will often, I think, have trouble guessing their sense of self because that they know they're aware of their messiness, and they're not having to distort it and try to look good or try to cover it up. So because of their messiness, they're going to often probably overly pathologize themselves a little bit in their attachment status. Is that true for your experience as well?
Yeah, yes. And I love what your son said. I'm still going to be there. I'm not
I know,
going
it's
anywhere.
okay.
Yeah. No, but I do think that that's hard for people to own that, and we can all develop more inner security. But yeah, I like the leaning to the blue or the red, because attachment, when you're feeling safe, we all look pretty secure. It's not about safety. It's about when we're in distress. And it's about when we were infants in distress and we adapted to whatever that situation was. So it's not even how our parents were so much in, after year one. It's in year one. So how are we supposed to have some kind of words to that, And we don't. If we look at the ways we measure attachment that have the most validity, there's this strange situation for a parent and child where we put them in this stressful situation where the parents walked out of a strange room twice, and now we're measuring reunion behavior on the second reunion. That stresses that system, right? And if we look at the adult attachment interview, which is a 1-hour interview that Mary Main and her colleagues developed at UC Berkeley, to assess an adult's attachment style, it's asking about your childhood in a way that gets underneath the story you tell about it. We all have our elevator speech of our childhood, our simplified version, but it gets at stuff below that. And that's why I think it's so incredibly valuable, because I think it stresses an adult enough in an hour as that baby is stressed and parent are stressed in that strange situation, that it reveals your attachment style. I remember being at a presentation by a AAI certified trainer, and she was saying, I took the test and it's not like I could lie. I know how you're supposed to answer and I couldn't do it right. It's not about giving the right answers. It's about it's about a lot about whether you can stay in good relationship to this interviewer while you're pondering your childhood in a slightly different way. It asks this very hard task of, give me 5 adjectives to describe your relationship. And you do it for each of the attachment figures that they had. And believe me, that's tough for people, because you're not asking them to describe the parent or themselves as a child, but the relationship between them. People have a lot of trouble with that. That's stressful enough. And then you go back and you ask for each adjective for a memory that goes with that adjective, of an interaction between them that fits that adjective. And to do that coherently, where the adjectives and the stories match, that's what indicates whether you have security or not.
And part of what that's measuring is your neural system and how your body responds to the stress and what pattern does it do to resolve it. I want to mention, because people will be interested in this, I typically use the adult attachment projective and Carol George's work for assessment, because it's very hard to find an AAP clinician just in the world. And so if you have a resource or a list or anything like, not AAP, I'm sorry, the AAI.
Yeah, certified. I don't, I think
They've been hard. I mean, I've looked around a lot. I think I asked Dan about this. Like, they're not easy to find, and they're very, very expensive, because it's a much more, the interview itself is so. I guess some of this is that most people won't get this test. And
No,
most people won't even get the AAP, which is, I want to mention it only because if you really do want to get tested, that is more accessible and it's faster, so it's less expensive. But that is adultattachmentprojective.org. That's a really good place to get the actual, developmental assessment for those of you who want that.
I think that's incredibly valuable. And I think, again, see, that's a very validated method for assessing attachment, unlike these online questionnaires you were mentioning earlier. And, the thing is that I think it's helpful to identify where you're starting from. But I also think people a lot of therapists that I have found have used the adult attachment interview questions in their therapy, not to give somebody an assignment of because that's not an official AAI in any way, shape, or form, but it is a way of understanding your client better and seeing what does their nervous system do when faced with these questions and how can they respond.
Okay, so let's do that right now, can we?
Okay.
So, for example, with our audience. So, why don't we just take one question and you ask it, but I'm gonna set it up just to give people a quick little taste of it. Okay, so those of you listening, just imagine that you're sitting across from Lisa and that you're in this interview, and we want you to, just follow her instructions and just notice what you feel, notice what comes out in your mind. If you have a chance to jot something down on the back of an envelope, that might be helpful. Okay, let's give them a taste of it.
So, the first thing I would ask you who would you see as attachment figures in your life? Was they your mother, your father, could have been a grandparent, who were those important people? And then I'm going to ask you for each one of those people. So we'll jot those people down. And then
and it might be 2 moms, 2 dads, just whoever was your
it might be
person
yes,
that you went to.
Absolutely. Was there anybody you could go to when you were upset as a kid to feel safe?
Which that's even interesting because it might not be the obvious who it's supposed to be, right? It might be the nanny who loved you and was around forever. That might be your attachment. So what you're saying is the person that when you're in distress, you want to go to, you want to call, you want to crawl up in their lap, okay. So list those people in your life.
List those people.
From your childhood.
Yes. And preferably, under age 7. Let's take the first one, whoever's the top of your list here. And can you give me 5 adjectives to describe not that person or yourself as a young child, but the relationship between you? And try to jot down 5 adjectives.
So can you give us an example? Or like in your own life?
Oh, okay. So one of mine with my father, who I lost a year ago. So that's a poor thing I'm still dealing with and grieving. But, but it's like, it was fun. He was very playful when I was a child. And he was just starting his practice as a clinical psychologist. So he was home a lot more when I was young, especially. My younger siblings didn't get as much of him in that way. And he was very physically playful. And so one thing I would describe our relationship as playful.
Okay, playful and fun. Okay. So as a listener, so get your adjectives, see if you can do 5. And then what? And
then, if you go back to each adjective, can you think of a memory or a time, an interaction between the two of you, whoever the person you're writing the adjectives about, where that exemplifies that adjective? So maybe it's my dad used to play a game of hiding something in his hand and we'd have to get it out, and we would get kitchen utensils. It became a whole thing. But it was, it was a playful, physically interactive kind of game. So whatever it is, can you come up with an adjective? And part of what you're looking for is, do those adjectives really fit? So, somebody who says, we had a respectful relationship, and then their adjective is, well, we left each other alone. Is that a respectful relationship between a parent and a very young child? No. Or an attachment figure and a very young child? You would think that most relationships between somebody you could go to when you were afraid were more interactive. I think about a patient who, one of the people that she did feel like with her father, at least she could get his companionship, which was harder to get from her mom, but it meant sitting in his office while he worked on papers. It wasn't really about an interaction between the two of them, but just being in his presence was more security than she had without that. So that was her security. But is that ideal for a young child? No.
So as you're listening, to your partner or to, as a therapist, if you're listening, that you're seeing, you used the word coherence a moment ago, which is an important term related to this, meaning your thoughts and feelings make sense. Because think about, again, I'm just talking to the listener. If you get lost in your story or in the feelings and you don't come up with 5 adjectives, you come up with 20 and they all have exclamation points after them, there's a pattern emerging, but you've lost the essence of the exercise, which was to reflect on your early life and stay connected to the person that you're speaking with, which is so difficult. Because I could, the other way it can look is that I'm so interested in getting the answer right for you, and is that right? And not, and tracking you. That's not a coherent. Going back to that word, that's not a coherent narrative because I'm not really able to reflect and consider my own thoughts and my own feelings because I'm overly focused here. So it's a really nice description of security, as you were talking about earlier, of I can have my thoughts and feelings, including about something that has a little energy and emotion, yet at the same time, I can be aware of how I'm coming across to you and stay connected to you.
Right. And I think the other extreme of that, lots with exclamation points, is none.
Yeah, right.
It was fine.
It was fine. It
was fine.
Healthy. It was healthy.
And I can't reflect on it at all, really, or go touch down into that place because that's way too uncomfortable. And I don't know that I can't. I just think everything is fine. That's a different strategy. But both of those are strategies where you can stay in good coherence, like you said, in both the relationship and in reflecting and coming up with something. And it's not that your child has had to be positive, by the way. It could be a very negative adjective, but the story should match too. If we can reflect on the hard things that happen too, which there's usually some hard things, right? Because people are messy.
Even in secure families, there's going to be letdowns, disappointments, attachment injuries, ruptures.
Yeah. And in good relationships, there's going to be those things too, right? And that we can weather those things, right? Because we can, work them through. But if we expect everything to be perfect with our parent or with anybody else, we're going to be very disappointed because we're people. We're messy. We're not very much in the black or the white. We're more in the gray,
Totally. And Patricia Quitterton talks about distortion. So nothing is wrong is a distortion unconsciously. Everything is big and loud and bold is it's a distortion. And what security is about is not needing to distort what I'm thinking or feeling or the information that I'm taking in. If you're looking at me wrong, the story that I fill in about that. These are other ways to get at what are your common triggers? That's going to give you a signal about your early adaptations. If somebody's late, do you think they're dead? Or, what's the story that you tell? And we were talking about this earlier about really getting in a couple, getting someone to focus on themselves and even knowing that there's a story in there, because we usually just assume.
Right. We just assume our stories are right? Because it's either the person is dead or, they are slighting me by not
exactly. Yeah. This is an issue of respect.
Is another story, right? I mean,
that's another story.
Another kind of story. But they're all stories, and we often see how our partner reacts. That's what we were talking about earlier. That's easy to see. Oh, yeah, they're overreacting or they're underreacting or whatever.
She's so needy.
Right. Or so shut down and doesn't understand that, wait, this really is a 10 out of 10, 10 and I was giving you the example of a older friend of mine who I recommended read the book because he's back in the dating pool. He lost his wife of many years, who was able to ride out the bumps of his personality really well. She had learned to not take him that seriously and get, overreactive to him. So that made their relationship go much more smoothly. But with somebody new that he's dating, she can get pretty triggered at moments. And he goes, oh, she's being so ridiculous. And he just leaves. That's his response. And the reality
This
is
is
that,
she's not rational.
right, she's not being rational. Oh, she's just, crazy. She's just whatever. She's a therapist, by the way, which I find amusing. But he doesn't understand that his shutting down and pulling back is just as much of a overreaction of a different attachment style. And it's helped him to see that he has more of a part in this, maybe, than he realized. And also, to slow down that whole thing, because when she's reacting, what is he doing? And what is it that he does that triggers her too? So we have our triggers, but, a lot of times, especially when we're getting into a new relationship, we don't know our partner's triggers, and we may stumble on them by accident and set them off. And we also see sometimes with long-term partners, they know exactly the triggers to pull when they want to create distance because they do know their partner's triggers. Ideally what we want to see is being more aware of your partner's triggers, but in a caring way of like, oh, okay, that might have been triggering to them. And what does that trigger in me? Even more importantly, where am I going with that? And how could I react differently? So I think both of those things are, recognizing our partner's triggers, but also ours. I always try to tell people, it takes two to tango. I'm always struck by the person who comes to see you because they want you to fix their partner who's not in the room. And then, what are you supposed to do with that? First of all, I think most of us at least realize that there's probably two parts to most things. And that part of how we can learn to be more containing to somebody who is getting triggered is to be able to manage our own emotions around that and not be so triggered ourselves. Because once you're both off to the races, it's really hard to resolve anything in those moments.
Yeah, we call that code dysregulation. There's co-regulation, there's also code dysregulation. And I certainly see that in group. It's very easy for in a group, somebody's talking about somebody out there and they can whip up a frenzy of like, I can't believe they treated you that way, and all the bad is out of the room and we're all good and we know what we're doing. And so it's a fun thing to confront about the bad's out there, the good's in here. It's like, let's begin to re-own our own complications and our own juicy messiness and warded off parts and all of that beautiful stuff that makes us human.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I think, unfortunately, I think all too for when therapists are only seeing one partner and that partner is looking pretty well put together because they're not stressed in our office so much, it can be easy to think that their partner really is just a mess and it's all out there. And I think, if we support that, we're really getting into a problem instead of, recognizing that there's probably a two-way dynamic. And I always say to people, you have a lot of power to change your relationship, but it's only to change your half of the relationship. You can shift yourself and see if your partner won't shift. You can think about what do you do just before they do that thing that you hate that sort of precipitates that reaction. And you can really work on that, and that's such a different focus than I've got to change them. But what can I do? And I think when we create more safety or security for our partner, we're going to at least have the best chance of having a receptive interaction with them. But we can do that all on our own, and if it doesn't shift them, I'd be surprised.
Yeah. It's one of those things that's well known, but very difficult to actually do when we're in it, to be able to turn the focus inward. Now, I know that you and Dan Siegel have done lots of things together, I believe, but one thing was related to our topic, which is how to see this in real life, IRL, and that you have a webinar about that. Can you speak a little bit about that for folks that are kind of interested in this but want more?
Yeah, we have a webinar we titled Making Sense of Your Life because I really do think understanding your attachment helps you make sense of your life. Certainly your romantic relationships, but also your relationships with your children, with people you care about. And, we tend to play these dynamics out everywhere. So we do it at work too, with our boss or whoever, with coworkers, so it can really help to make sense out of what's going on for you and how you're reacting that might be based on adaptations you made in the past, which were the best adaptations you could possibly make to whatever the social environment you found yourself in when you got born. So what we did is we tried to walk people through understanding their attachment on this kind of deeper level. So we start with some videotapes where Dan and I first play out the dynamics of what it looks like between a parent and a child if you're with the different attachment patterns and what that adaptation kind of looks like, and putting words to things that, a 1-year-old is not going to put words to in a coherent way. But, as Dan says, we're kind of anthropomorphizing infants, but we're, sort of saying, so, this is the story that you start to tell yourself about how interactions go between you and other people. If it's okay to express wants and needs, how they are going to get responded to, what you need to do to get them responded to. And then we also have exercises for them to do that are derived from the adult attachment interview, Mary Main's instrument, to help them start to identify their attachment pattern. And we have them do some journaling and self-reflection. And then we also talk about how these play out in adult relationships. And then we have some series of videotapes that sort of show the different ways of relating depending on what we or our partner might be bringing to the table in terms of our adaptations. And then we also walk people through things they can do to develop more inner security. So we give them, first of all, a toolkit, and we do that right at the beginning, of strategies for managing emotions, because we're asking them to stir up all kinds of hard stuff in just reflecting on these things. But we want them to have some good, healthy strategies for dealing with that. So we developed a whole toolkit, and we have, I think it's a video with me explaining the different skills in the toolkit. And then we have them do the part about their childhood. We look at their adult relating. We also talk about triggers. And Dan gives an example of a physiological kind of trigger for him where he had this really serious horse accident as a young man. He was working for the World Health Organization somewhere in rural Mexico, I believe it was, and he was on the saddle of a horse where it turned upside down and dragged him. I mean, he was very lucky to be alive and not have a broken spine. But, it was a very severe accident. And many, many years later, when he was doing a presentation in some city, he was in his hotel room eating his dinner, and he turned on the movie that they had available in the hotel, and it was Seabiscuit, which is about a horse. But one of the things that happens in that movie is the rider actually goes upside down. He just found his body doing that as he's watching this. And, originally he couldn't even watch movies that had horses in them, and he used to love horses after this accident. He got through that, but he had slowly worked through some parts of it. But just that he had never seen an actual visualization of that trauma that he had experienced, and it triggered him. And then we talk about triggers, and Dan's contention is that triggers can be your friend because they give you information. They tell you something about unresolved issues for you.
Well, and it's so good that people can learn directly from the father, grandfather of so much of this work, and you, and by extension, by your father, that they can hear these things directly from you guys. Now, where would they find that? What's the title of the webinar?
It's called Making Sense of Your Life, and it's on our website, Psych Alive. It just sort of walks people through. We also walk people through resolving unresolved trauma. So the exercise we do for that, which people might want to try, is write down 10 traumas that happened when you were a child really quickly. Give yourself just like 5 minutes to do that. And it's, there are people, and I'm sure, Sue, you've seen people where they could write 10 with subcategories under each. But most people, that's a really hard ask because they're like, wait, I didn't have any trauma, or I had very little trauma. So I find that the most fascinating exercise when I'm training professionals to do, because people come up with things that they didn't realize. Even people who've had a lot of therapy, have done a lot of therapy themselves, hadn't quite realized that maybe some of these things are not as resolved as they thought.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm thinking about our interview with Pennebaker about journaling that is so, again, science-backed of how healing it can be. Well, good. So for folks who are interested in learning more from you, what are your socials? How do they reach you?
They can reach me at my email, which is lfirestone@glendon, GLENDON.org. They can reach the course and materials that we've done on Psych Alive. And again, I'm here in Santa Barbara if anybody wants to reach out.
That's wonderful. And is there any just final thoughts, just as we wrap up, that you want to be sure that people hear?
Just the reason to me that the attachment work and like the book that you wrote is so important is that we can do things about this. We can have better relationships and a much more fulfilling life where we feel much more alive, much more ourselves by understanding ourselves better and by, recognizing where we go when we're distressed and learning how we can do things differently.
Yeah. And I love you going with the ending message of hope because it is so hopeful, and that we're getting better and better at treating trauma. The technologies are getting better. We know more what's happening now than we used to. And so it is actually very, 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 very hopeful. So I really love that.
And it's hopeful for all of us, even if we haven't had what we would consider big T trauma, we're all messy and we can all have more closeness and more enjoyment in our lives and more fulfillment in our relationships if we got more aware of all of this. That's what I would say.
Wonderful. And I love all the resources on Psych Alive. Lisa has mentioned the book, Secure Relating, Holding Your Own in an Insecure World, that Anne and I published last year. We'll have all of these things on our show notes. You can find us at therapistuncensored.com / it'll say /episodes. We'll give you all the episodes. And then you can also use the search button and search for attachment, modern attachment, Lisa Firestone, Psych Alive, all of those things. We'll bring it up. Our show notes are chock full of additional resources, and we'll certainly add some in this case as well. Thank you very much for joining us and for all of your work over the years, for all of your contributions. And for those of you listening, if you're still with us, it means that you got some value, we hope. And if you wouldn't mind stopping and giving us a rating and review on wherever you're getting your podcasts, that's the best way to spread the word. We have this huge archive of free, completely free resources and all these experts. And many of the people we mentioned today are in the catalog. So we really want to get that out wide and far. And a rating and a review is a great way to do that, or to share the episode. That's another really good way to just kind of spread the word. All right. Well, thanks for listening, and we will see you around the bend.
Therapist Uncensored is Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott. This podcast is edited by Jack Anderson.